Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Oh, yeah.
Today we're diving into The Weirdest People in the World.
I love that book.
It's by Joseph Henrich.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating exploration of why people from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. Weird, for sure,
That's us.
and act so differently from the rest of humanity.
Yeah, it's a question we don't often ask ourselves.
Oh, right.
We tend to assume our way of thinking is just the natural way.
Yeah.
But Henrich challenges that assumption in a big way.
Right. And he doesn't just point out these differences. He traces their roots back centuries.
Oh, yeah.
Arguing that specific cultural shifts, particularly those driven by the Western Church, literally reshaped our minds.
It's wild. It's like he's saying that stuff that happened way back when is still messing with us.
I know, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get lost in the details, let's zoom out for a second.
Okay.
What are some of the key takeaways you walked away with after reading this book?
Well, one of the central themes is the power of culture to shape our psychology.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Henrich argues that culture isn't just a set of customs or traditions. It's a powerful force that interacts with our biology,
Okay.
molding our brains and shaping our cognitive processes.
So it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture working together.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
And the book offers compelling evidence for this, drawing on a wide range of disciplines, psychology, anthropology, history, economics, to build his case.
Wow, so it's really interdisciplinary.
Super interdisciplinary,
Quite
which
so.
I really liked.
I'm already intrigued.
Yeah.
So where does Henrich begin this exploration of weird psychology?
Well, he starts by highlighting those peculiar traits that set weird folks apart.
Okay.
The individualism, the obsession with the self,
Yeah.
the analytical thinking, the nonconformity,
Yeah.
the intense focus on controlling their environment. These aren't necessarily bad things, but they are unusual when you compare them to the rest of the world.
Right. And it's funny because these traits seem so normal to us.
Totally.
It's like a fish trying to describe water.
Exactly. And Henrich does a great job of pulling us out of that water, so to speak, and showing us just how strange these weird traits can seem from an outside perspective.
Yeah.
There's this one passage where he compares how people from a weird society and those from a traditional Kenyan tribe describe themselves.
Oh, wow.
It's striking.
Yeah.
The weird participants talk about their personal attributes and achievements. I'm ambitious. I'm good at math.
Yeah.
While the Kenyans define themselves in terms of their roles and relationships. I'm a father. I'm a member of this clan.
Wow, that really highlights how even our sense of self, something we often consider inherent, is actually shaped by the culture we grow up in.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And that difference in self-perception ripples outwards, influencing everything from how we interact with others to how we design our institutions.
Wow, so this is like really foundational stuff he's talking about.
Big-time foundational.
Okay, so how does Henrich explain the origins of these weird traits?
Yeah.
What's the cultural detective work he does to uncover their roots?
Okay, so he takes us back to the Middle Ages and points to the influence of the Western Church.
Interesting.
Specifically, he focuses on a set of practices he calls the Marriage and Family Program, or MFP.
The MFP.
Now, you might be thinking, what do medieval marriage rules have to do with my psychology today?
Yeah.
But this is where it gets really fascinating.
Okay, color me intrigued.
I'm going to color you intrigued.
What exactly is this MFP and how did it reshape Western minds?
Okay, so the MFP is a collection of marriage and family practices that the church promoted and enforced throughout the Middle Ages.
Okay.
Things like banning cousin marriage, discouraging polygamy, promoting individual inheritance, and emphasizing the nuclear family. These rules might seem arbitrary, but they had a profound and unintended consequence.
Like, what's that?
They weakened what Henrich calls intensive kinship.
Intensive kinship.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically those tight-knit family structures where your entire life revolves around your extended family and clan.
Exactly.
Okay.
Got it. And by weakening those kinship ties, the church inadvertently set off a cascade of psychological and social changes.
Okay.
As people became less tethered to their extended families, they developed a greater sense of individual agency and became more comfortable interacting with strangers and engaging in impersonal transactions.
So it's almost like the church accidentally created the conditions for individualism to flourish. I mean, they weren't setting out to do that, right?
Not at all. Their motivations were primarily religious, but the unintended consequences were profound.
Wow. Okay, so the MFP set the stage, but Henrich doesn't stop there, right?
Nope.
He argues that other historical forces amplify these weird tendencies.
Uh-huh.
Okay, let's...
He points to the constant warfare in Europe during the Middle Ages and the rise of market economies as crucial amplifiers.
Okay.
War, for example, forced people to rely on voluntary associations and impersonal norms for survival, further weakening traditional kinship structures.
Interesting.
And markets, with their emphasis on fairness and impartiality, rewarded those who could think analytically and act independently.
So it's like a perfect storm of cultural evolution, these different forces converging to select for those weird traits that ultimately help people thrive in the unique environment of Western societies.
Yeah, it's like a recipe for weirdness.
I love it.
A little bit of this, a little bit of that, boom, weird.
And it's not just about individual psychology, right?
Yep.
These weird traits also had a profound impact on the kinds of institutions that emerged in the West.
Totally.
Things like representative democracy, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. These are all complex systems that rely on impersonal rules, abstract principles, and a belief in individual agency. Things that wouldn't have made much sense in societies dominated by intensive kinship.
It's like a whole different operating system for society.
Yeah. I see. So this shift in psychology wasn't just an abstract phenomenon.
Right.
It had real-world consequences shaping the course of history in a very tangible way.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One thing leads to another.
Okay, all right. So we've established that weird psychology is a product of specific historical circumstances. But how did it end up spreading so widely beyond Europe? I mean, it's not like the Western Church was calling the shots everywhere.
That's a great question, and one we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Henrich explores how weird psychology, along with its associated institutions, became a kind of cultural export, spreading across the globe through various means, some more forceful than others. But for now, let's stick with the origins of this unique way of thinking.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so we've got this MFP weakening those tight family ties, making people more individualistic.
Yeah.
But the church also played another crucial role in shaping weird minds, right?
Yes.
I'm thinking about the impact of literacy.
You're on the right track. Literacy is a key piece of the puzzle. You see, while the church's motives for promoting literacy were largely religious, we wanted people to read the Bible, the long-term consequences were much broader.
It's fascinating how something that seems so simple, like learning to read, can have such a profound impact on how we think.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's like rewiring the brain.
Yeah.
And the book delves into those impacts. Research shows that literacy actually changes the brain.
Wow.
Leading to the specialization of certain regions involved in visual word recognition, language processing, even our ability to think about other people's minds.
So it's like literacy rewired our brains for abstract thinking, analysis, and even a bit more empathy.
Exactly.
Wow, okay.
And those changes have ripple effects. Henrich cites studies showing that literacy is correlated with higher cognitive test scores, a greater emphasis on individual achievement, and even a reduced tendency to conform to social pressure. Sound familiar?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We're back to those classic weird traits.
Precisely. And remember, these changes unfolded over centuries, generation after generation.
Wow.
It's a powerful example of how culture, operating over time, can reshape the very foundations of human thought.
This is all so intriguing.
Isn't it?
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this book.
We have, and there's so much more to unpack.
Oh, good.
But before we move on, I'd love to get your initial thoughts. What's resonating with you so far?
Honestly, it's the sheer scale of it all that's blowing my mind. The idea that events from centuries ago, like medieval marriage rules or the push for literacy, could still be influencing how we think and act today is incredible.
Right. It's like our minds are haunted by the ghosts of history.
I know, I love that. It makes you wonder, if culture can be such a powerful force, what does that mean for the future of humanity as we become increasingly interconnected in a globalized world?
That's a great question, and one we'll tackle later in our deep dive. But first, let's delve deeper into the specific consequences of the church's MFP. How did these changes in family structure play out in everyday life? And how did they shape the Western mind?
Let's do it. I'm ready to go deeper down this rabbit hole.
All right, let's go. So we've talked about how the church's marriage and family program, the MFP, weakened those intensive kinship structures that were so common throughout history. But what does that actually mean for how people lived and interacted?
Right, because it's one thing to talk about abstract concepts like kinship, but I'm curious about the concrete ways this played out in people's daily lives.
Well, imagine a world where your social standing, your economic opportunities, even your personal identity are all deeply intertwined with your extended family and clan. That was the reality for most people before the MFP.
So it's like your fate was largely determined by who you were related to.
Exactly, but the MFP started to chip away at that system.
Okay.
By prohibiting cousin marriage, the church forced people to look beyond their immediate family for partners, which meant forming alliances and building trust with people from different backgrounds.
That makes sense. It's like a forced mingling of social circles.
Exactly, and this mingling had ripple effects.
Hmm.
The book argues that the decline of intensive kinship contributed to a decline in what's called in-group favoritism.
Okay.
That's the tendency to prioritize the needs of your own group over those of outsiders.
So if you're not as tightly bound to a specific clan or tribe, you're more open to interacting with people from different backgrounds, maybe even trusting them.
Precisely, and this openness to strangers is a hallmark of weird psychology.
Okay.
It's reflected in our willingness to cooperate with anonymous others, to trust people we've never met before.
That's so interesting because we take that trust for granted.
Yeah.
I mean, think about online shopping.
Oh, yeah.
We're essentially trusting a complete stranger with our money and personal information.
It's true. It's a level of trust that would have been unthinkable in societies dominated by intensive kinship, where interactions were primarily limited to people you knew and could vouch for.
Right. Okay, so the MFP led to greater individualism and a willingness to trust strangers.
Hmm?
What other psychological consequences emerged from this shift?
Well, the book argues that the decline of intensive kinship also fostered a more analytical way of thinking. When your world revolves around navigating complex family relationships and obligations, you develop a different cognitive style than someone whose world is more impersonal and transaction-based.
So you're saying that as people became less reliant on their families, they had to develop new ways of thinking and problem solving.
Exactly, and those new ways of thinking involved breaking things down into their component parts, analyzing systems, and focusing on abstract principles rather than personal relationships.
Which sounds a lot like the analytical thinking that's so characteristic of weird folks. It's like the MFP inadvertently laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, all those movements that emphasized reason and logic.
That's a fascinating connection, and it highlights how these cultural shifts can have ripple effects that extend far beyond their initial context.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got this fascinating link between the decline of intensive kinship and the rise of weird psychology.
Mhm.
But I'm curious, did Henrich find any concrete evidence to support this idea? Like, did he look at any real-world examples of how these changes played out?
Oh, absolutely. He doesn't just theorize, he backs up his claims with a ton of research.
Okay, good.
One compelling example comes from a study that looked at how people from different cultures perform on a classic psychology experiment called the Asch conformity experiment.
Oh, I've heard of that one. It's the one where they show you a line and ask you to match it to one of three other lines, right?
That's the one. But here's the twist. Everyone else in the room who are actually actors on the experiment intentionally gives the wrong answer.
Oh, wow. So it's designed to see if you'll conform to group pressure, even when you know it's wrong.
Exactly, and what's fascinating is that people from weird societies are much less likely to conform in this experiment compared to people from societies with more intensive kinship.
So even in a contrived situation like this, those weird tendencies towards individualism and independent thinking shine through.
They do, and the book suggests that this isn't just a quirk of weird psychology, it's a reflection of how our brains have been shaped by centuries of cultural evolution.
Okay, I'm convinced that the MFP was a major turning point, but I know Henrich argues that other historical forces amplified these weird tendencies. Let's talk about those. What role did war play in shaping Western minds?
Well, imagine living in medieval Europe. It was a time of constant warfare, with small polities vying for power and territory.
Not exactly a relaxing environment to be in.
No, it wasn't. And this constant threat forced people to band together for protection. But those alliances weren't solely based on kinship ties anymore. People had to learn to cooperate with individuals from outside their immediate family circles.
So it was a case of survival of the fittest, but fittest in this context meant being able to cooperate and trust strangers.
Exactly. War, in a way, accelerated the psychological shifts that were already underway as a result of the MFP. Those who are good at forming these cross-kinship alliances were more likely to survive and pass on their genes and, importantly, their cultural values.
And those cultural values included things like individualism, trust in strangers, and a willingness to cooperate outside of traditional family structures.
Precisely. It's a fascinating example of how environmental pressures can drive cultural evolution, shaping our psychology in ways that we might not even be aware of.
Okay, war makes sense as an amplifier of weird traits. But what about markets? How did those contribute to this psychological shift?
Well, think about what a market economy demands. It's a system where people from all walks of life come together to buy and sell goods and services. These transactions are often with people you don't know personally. Success in market economy relies on fairness, impartiality, and individual achievement.
So in a market-based society, you can't just rely on your family connections to get ahead. You have to develop those weird traits of self-reliance, analytical thinking, and a willingness to engage in impersonal transactions.
That's the argument. And as markets grew in complexity and influence, they further amplified these psychological tendencies.
It's amazing how a system designed for economic exchange can have such profound and lasting effects on our minds.
It really is, and it highlights how interconnected our social, economic, and psychological worlds are. These systems don't exist in isolation. They shape and influence each other in complex and often unexpected ways.
All right, so we've got the MFP weakening kinship ties, war forcing cooperation with strangers, and markets rewarding individualism and fairness. It's a potent mix of historical forces that helps explain why weird folks are so well weird.
And we haven't even touched on everything, but this is a good place to pause and reflect. What's standing out to you as we delve deeper into this topic?
Honestly, it's the sheer scope of Henrich's argument that's so impressive. He's not just offering a psychological theory, he's weaving together insights from history, anthropology, economics, and even neuroscience to paint this grand narrative of how culture shaped the Western mind.
It's a truly interdisciplinary approach, and that's what makes it so compelling.
Absolutely. It's not often you get a book that can connect medieval marriage rules to the rise of Silicon Valley, but Henrich manages to pull it off.
He does, and in a way that's both thought-provoking and entertaining, but we've only explored half the story. How did this unusual psychology, born in the crucible of Western history, end up spreading across the globe? That's a question for our final part.
I'm eager to hear more. This has been a fascinating deep dive, and I'm already looking at the world with a fresh perspective. Okay, so we've established that weird psychology is a product of specific historical circumstances, but how did it end up spreading so widely beyond Europe? I mean, it's not like the Western Church was calling the shots everywhere.
Right. That's a great question, and it brings us to the next chapter of this story. Henrich explores how weird psychology, along with its associated institutions, became a kind of cultural export spreading across the globe through a complex interplay of factors.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What were some of the key drivers of this weird expansion?
Well, one factor is undoubtedly the economic and military power of Western societies. For centuries, they dominated global trade exploration and, unfortunately, conquest. This dominance gave them the means to impose their ways of thinking on others, sometimes through force, sometimes through more subtle forms of influence.
So it's partly a story of power dynamics. The weird folks were in a position to shape the world in their image, so to speak.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it, but it's important to remember that power alone doesn't explain why weird ideas took root in so many different cultures. Henrich argues that there's also something inherently appealing about certain weird values and institutions.
Okay, what makes these ideas so attractive, even to people from very different cultural backgrounds?
Well, think about concepts like individual liberty, human rights, democratic governance. These ideas resonate with a deep-seated human desire for autonomy, fairness, and a voice in shaping one's destiny. Even though weird psychology is unusual from a historical and cross-cultural perspective, it taps into something fundamental about the human experience.
So it's not just about Western dominance, it's also about the resonance of certain weird values with human aspirations across cultures.
Exactly. And this resonance has made it easier for weird ideas to take root, even in societies with very different historical trajectories. It's like the seeds of weird psychology found fertile ground in many parts of the world.
That's a great analogy, but it's not a uniform spread, right? I imagine there are places where weird ideas clashed with existing cultural norms and values.
Absolutely. Henrich acknowledges that the spread of weird psychology hasn't been without its challenges and conflicts. When weird ideas and institutions are imposed on societies that lack those underlying psychological foundations, it can create friction and resistance.
It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole. You can apply pressure, but it's not going to be a smooth fit.
That's a good way to put it. And this is where the book's insights become really important. If we understand the deep historical and psychological roots of weird psychology, We can better navigate these cultural differences, avoid simplistic assumptions, and promote more nuanced and respectful cross-cultural understanding.
Yeah. So it's not about erasing differences or imposing one way of thinking on everyone. It's about recognizing that those differences exist for a reason and finding ways to bridge those divides.
Exactly, and that's crucial in our increasingly globalized world.
Okay, so we've talked about the origins of weird psychology, its consequences, and its global spread. But I'm curious, what does Henrich say about the future of weirdness? Is it destined to become the dominant mode of thought worldwide? Or will it evolve and adapt as it encounters new cultural and technological landscapes?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And to be honest, Henrik doesn't offer any definitive predictions. He suggests that weird psychology will likely continue to evolve, but the direction of that evolution is uncertain. It depends on a multitude of factors: technological advancements, demographic shifts, cultural exchanges, and even the choices we make as individuals and societies.
So the story of weird psychology is still being written. It's not a fixed endpoint, but an ongoing process.
Exactly. And that makes it all the more important to understand where we came from and how we got here, because that knowledge can help us navigate the complexities of the present and make more informed choices about the future.
Well said. I think one of the most important takeaways from The Weirdest People in the World is that it encourages us to question our assumptions, to recognize the power of culture, to shape our minds, and to approach cultural differences with curiosity and humility.
I completely agree. It's a book that challenges us to see ourselves and the world around us in a new light, to appreciate the diversity of human thought,
Hmm.
and to recognize that our ways of thinking aren't inevitable or absolute.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. It's made me rethink so much of what I took for granted about human nature, and I encourage everyone listening to pick up a copy of the book and explore these ideas for themselves.
Yeah. There's so much more to uncover. And as always, there's more to learn, so keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Until next time.